In this video, we are trying to understand the dynamics of the economy, or what are the things that affects the economy or changes the equilibrium state of the economy. So there are three reasons that one can think about. So let's understand each one of them. Now, when we are in this world whereby you are below the capacity, that means that we are not using all the resources. Human resource, say one example, labor is not being used to its full extent. So some people are not having job at this point. And since they are not having job, they would be willing to work for less, right? So in this case, wages have a tendency to go down, and when wages go down, recollect that wages is one of the input costs, is something that is needed for production and is one of the determinants of aggregate supply. And that is going to mean that when wages go down, profits are higher, and that would mean that the businesses would want to supply more, right? And supply more is represented by the right shift of the supply curve. So here's our initial supply curve, AS0, and because the actual GDP is below the full capacity GDP, through the adjustment of labor market, for example, you can think of other resources as well. The overall profitability of the corporations will be higher, and hence businesses would be willing to supply more. And so as a result, supply will shift to the right. More is on the right side, and let's shift the supply to AS1 from AS0, and so the equilibrium moves from E0 to E1. And at E1, the situation is still the same. We are still facing recessionary gap, and this process will still hold true, and the supply will still shift right from AS1 to AS2. And at AS2, we are still having the same situation, though we are narrowing down the gap slowly. There is still a gap, right? And as long as there is a gap, this mechanism of correction will keep on happening, and hence what is known as self-correction. And it will stop the correction process once we hit the long run aggregate supply curve. So that's your long run aggregate supply curve, and that will mean that your aggregate supply curve will shift from AS0 to AS3, and your equilibrium move from E0 to E3, right? And so GDP will move back to its full capacity slowly and steadily, of course, and prices will go down slowly. Now notice I have drawn several curves before we hit AS3, because we want to represent that this correction process of shifting of aggregate supply. In case of inflationary gap, you are overusing a resource, right? And if you overuse a resource, if you work overtime, you obviously ask for higher wages, right? And hence the profitability of the businesses will be lower because the businesses are paying overtime, and as a result, they would want to supply less, right? And supply less would mean a left shift. Again, this process will happen slowly, and so aggregate supply will slowly shift on the left from AS0 to AS1 to AS2, and then AS3. Maybe you can think about this as 1 year, each of these years, and so it takes 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, whatever is the speed of correction. So slowly and steadily, you move your equilibrium from E0 to E3, right? And as a result, your GDP slowly moves back to its full capacity, and the prices will slowly rise, right? And so if you notice the end product, as far as GDP is concerned, whether you are below the capacity or you are above the capacity, the end product is the same in the long run, which is you move to your full capacity output. You move to the full capacity output. In the second scenario, when you are above the capacity, look at what is happening to the prices, which is rising. And if you are overusing the resource, eventually you will see prices higher, and as a result, the word is known as inflation, which is hence this kind of a gap is known as inflationary gap. So this is the self-correcting mechanism. Then the economy can be affected by what we can label it as shocks. right? Now, what is the difference between shocks and the previous one? The gradualness. So the correction process is gradual, but here it's a shock. So shocks does not happen gradually. Shock is a shock. It just bangs on the economy. And in taken two different examples, you can take as many examples as one can imagine, but let's take two examples. One is, say, consumers are not so confident about the state of the economy, like for example in times of COVID, consumers are not confident about what's going to happen, and hence they would spend less, right? So which is represented by consume less, which is consumption spending will be lower, and consumption spending is one of the factors which affects aggregate demand, and so the aggregate demand will be lower, right? And so because of consumer confidence being affected negatively, the aggregate demand will be lower, and this will be reflected by a shift of aggregate demand to the left, and so the GDP will contract, Y star will be lower, and your prices will also be lower, so P star will also be lower, right? Now notice in this one we are not so much concerned right now as far as where is the full potential capacity. So if you have a YF either here or here or here, the self-correcting mechanisms will always be playing its part, right? So once you have this YF over here or here or here or here for that matter, uh, in addition to the economic shocks, the self-correcting mechanisms will always play. What is self-correcting mechanism again? Anytime you are not at your full capacity, right? You're not at full capacity, the aggregate supply will start moving. Aggregate supply will start shifting, right? We don't know in this case where is our YF. The second scenario is, think about input cost going up, right? So cost of production goes up. If cost of production goes up, profitability of the businesses will be lower, right? And if profits are lower, they would want to supply less, and less is on the left side, supplying less of units or products, and hence the aggregate supply will shift left from AS0 to AS1, and the equilibrium moves from E0 to E1. Right? So in this case, GDP will contract, the economy contracts, and your prices will be higher. So you'll see inflation in the economy. And the third reason why the economy will change or will move is policy shocks. You can think about two policies: fiscal policy, and the second policy is monetary policy. The fiscal policy has two tools: government spending and taxes. Both these tools can be used to affect aggregate demand. And then for monetary policy, one can think about using interest rate or money supply as a tool to affect aggregate demand, right? So let's sum up everything. Policy shocks will affect demand, or also known as demand management policies. Economic shocks can affect aggregate demand or may affect aggregate supply. It depends on the type of the shock. So shock could be through the demand, or shock could happen to the supply. And the self-correcting mechanism will always work through aggregate supply, because it's through the supply forces which you correct from Y star to, your gap situation to no gap situation. Okay, so self-correcting mechanism, it's through aggregate supply. Shocks, economic shocks, can happen to demand or supply, and policy shocks will mean it's about demand. Now the difference between policy shocks and economic shocks, we are using both those terms as shocks, is that this economic shocks are not controlled for, they just hit the economy, whereas policy shocks are having a particular intention in mind, and typically it is to mitigate the effects of these economic shocks or to speed up the process of self-correcting mechanism. So policy shocks are more intentional. It is intended to create more jobs, is intended to control prices or having inflation under control. And hence we would want to be mindful about the difference between economic shocks and the policy shocks, which are kind of more policy response to economic shocks or policy response to self-correcting mechanism.